The Hapsburg Dynasty arose from Switzerland in the Middle Ages and came to rule swathes of Central and Eastern Europe in various forms for over 600 years. They established a seat of power in Vienna, which was transformed into a cultural and imperial metropolis. Revolution, however, swept across Europe in 1848 and unsettled the secure, structured existence that characterized life under the Habsburgs. Military defeats and nationalist fervor in the wake of 1848 eventually led to the Compromise of 1867, when the weakened Habsburgs ceded to sovereignty demands from their Hungarian subjects and established the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary continued a slow decline, which was immortalized by authors such as Stefan Zweig and Joseph Roth through the rest of the 19th century. Ultimately, in 1918, after the defeat of the Central Powers in the First World War, the empire was dissolved and the last Habsburg emperor, 30-year-old Charles I, was sent into exile, initially to Switzerland and then to Madeira. And yet, the Habsburg name has not disappeared from European political life. I'm so delighted today to be joined now by Archduke Edward of Austria, Hungary's ambassador to the Holy See. Well, Your Excellency, thank you very much for joining me. You are the Archduke of Austria. Can you explain to me what that means and how you come to have this fantastic title?
I'm not the Archduke, I'm one of the Archdukes of Austria because, very simply said, every Habsburg is an Archduke of Austria. And it's a title that we discovered we had in the 15th century from a very spurious document that was supposedly written by Caesar himself. And at first, the emperor didn't agree with this document that we found, but a bit later, a Habsburg was emperor, and then it became law. So since then, we are archdukes.
So you're archdukes thanks to a forged document of Julius Caesar himself?
Forged? I'm not sure. I haven't analyzed the document, but
carefully.
People say it's forged.
It's a bit like the donation of Constantine, that
yes.
A wonderful thing to have in your family tree. And your family were minor princes and then suddenly became Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph in the 13th century.
Yes, indeed. Rudolph was a count somewhere between Switzerland, France and Germany around Le Mans Lake. And then after the interregnum, which were nearly 50 years of no emperor, the prince-electors decided to take someone who was harmless, friendly, old, and would certainly not found a dynasty. And so they chose Rudolph of Habsburg. And so his job was to clean up the empire again. And one of the things he had to do is to see that parts of the empire that had been taken over by others, Ottokar of Bohemia had taken Austria, would get into good hands. And he handed it to his sons. And that's how the Austrian power base of the Habsburgs came about.
And the empire was elective. And the point of appointing Rudolph, as you mentioned, was actually to make sure it wasn't powerful and to make sure it went to somebody who was relatively minor and so that they could keep on shuffling it round as they saw fit.
Yes.
But once Rudolph had got it, it remained firmly in your family until it was dissolved at the beginning of the 19th century.
Well, I would have to disagree because just after Rudolph, there was a long gap where the Habsburgs were on the periphery of power, weren't part of the prince-electors. For about 120 years, they were quite depressed, sitting in Vienna and trying to build up a name for them. That's when the Archduke title came around.
So how do they get back in?
At some point, Habsburg was elected again. By then, we had a university, we had a cathedral in Vienna. But after that, except for a very tiny moment in the 18th century, the emperor was always a Habsburg. And it was a very different kind of empire than what we imagine nowadays. As you said, this was a game of diplomacy and shuffling. It was not this cackling, strong, powerful emperor oppressing everybody.
And there's a wonderful story of one of the emperors who gives his horse to a priest. Yes. And therefore, in return, gets all these benefits from God. Perhaps you could tell me about that.
Well, it wasn't just one. It was our first emperor, Rudolph. Rudolph, when he was still count and hunting in his forests in Aargau in Switzerland. One day he saw, when the river was swollen from from the rains, he saw a priest who wanted to bring the viatic, the body of Christ, to a dying man. And he gave him his horse so he could cross the river. So the priest went to bring the last sacraments, came back, wanted to give the horse back. And Rudolph said, "Far be it from me that I would ever ride on a horse again that carried my Savior." So he was a devout man, and the people in the area said, "This gesture will get its prize from God." And when Pius X told Empress Zita that her husband will be emperor, he said he's going to be the prize of God for the fidelity of the Habsburgs. And that was the first Habsburg who became a saint. Well, blessed so far.
And the connection to the church remained extraordinarily strong, though sometimes fractious, during the whole period of Habsburg rule. So the last emperor but one vetoed the papal conclave's decision, which led to Pope Pius X.
Yes, yes. That was a special right of Catholic emperors. In fact, Cardinal Rampolla was supposed to become Pope, and Pope Franz Joseph, through a Polish cardinal, put in a veto. The cardinals were furious. Also, the future Pius X was furious, and weeks after he became Pope, he abolished that right. But the Habsburgs helped along one of the greatest saints of the 20th century to become Pope. So I'm quite proud of that. And
it's a reminder of the very strong link, the intimate relationship, though sometimes difficult one. And perhaps the emperor who's best known in the United Kingdom is the Emperor Charles V,
yes,
because he was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon,
yes,
and was, of course, the emperor at the point at which the Reformation came about.
Yes.
Now, his election is fascinating because Francis I of France and Henry VIII both think they've got a chance of being Holy Roman Emperor, but
yes,
of course they don't.
No, they don't. And the interesting thing was that nobody expected it to be that unanimous, how he was. And the moment he became emperor, he was thrown into one of the greatest crises, because Reformation divided his empire into opposing parties. You never had that. You never had that in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. So he agreed to doing the Diet of Worms and to confront that heretic, Luther, to give him free access and to guarantee his safety. And then he made a very, very clear statement I'm very proud of, as a Catholic, I have to say. He said very clearly, for 2,000 years, 1,500 years, the greatest thinkers of the church have agreed to these points. Why should I follow one German monk on this? My ancestors always stood with Rome, and that's what we'll do. And so Luther is a heretic, according to him.
Indeed, and according to many people in addition. And I've always admired the Emperor Charles V for being on, to my mind, the right side of the Reformation, of this very clear statement of faith. But that didn't always stop his relations with the papacy being difficult. So you have actually the sack of Rome, don't you, in 1525, after the Battle of Pavia, when the emperor's troops win, but they then get rather enthusiastic.
They got carried away, you would say. Well, it didn't have anything to do with the emperor. That was independent of the emperor. So don't mention the Sacco di Roma in Rome and two Habsburgs.
All right, we'll brush over the sack of Rome. But the Emperor Charles V then spent the rest of his life, really, until he retires, and that's quite interesting, his retirement to a monastery, until he retires, trying to maintain the Habsburg influence in its hereditary lands, which are huge at that point.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of the scale of what he was governing?
What you have to see is that about the end of the 15th century, the Habsburgs were basically in Austria, and then in a very few years, suddenly they got Burgundy, which is the Spanish Netherlands, and Belgium and the Netherlands today, and Hungary and Bohemia, and then Spain, and with Spain, the entire world. So in very few years, when he was a little boy, the Habsburgs basically exploded onto the world scene and had possessions all over the world. In the Americas, huge possessions. I always like to joke that Texas, Florida, and California are old Habsburg territories. Americans love that when you say that.
But it's true, they were.
Yes, They were of the Spanish Habsburgs,
right.
and the Philippines were called the Philippines because of King Philip of Spain. And so what I'm saying is the Habsburgs suddenly had to look after an empire where the sun never sets.
And it's all by the chance of marriage, isn't it? So the Emperor Maximilian marries his son, Philip of Burgundy, to the Burgundian heiress. And Burgundy is, at least in part, a fiefdom of France. So it's not the most powerful place. Then, of course, Philip marries Joanna the Mad of Spain and becomes the sole heiress to Spain. And this all falls into the lap of this very, very young Charles V, who is faced with the intellectual challenge of marrying a vast empire and the Reformation, one of the biggest challenges of history. And he manages to keep it all together.
Yes. I always like there is a famous tapestry that I saw in a castle in Burgundy, where you see the visit of Henry VIII meeting first François Ier and then Charles V. And François Ier made that famous scene. I don't know how it's called. I think the
Field of the Cloth of Gold.
Field of Cloth of Gold. And when he met Charles V, it was one simple tent with 2 chairs. Charles V was incredibly Spartan. I like that about him. He was very Spartan. He was very bright. He had an incredible sense of humor. You're aware that he had, of course, the famous Habsburg jaw that amuses our American friends to no end. And what he always did is when he said, yes, it's true, my mouth is always open and my jaw is always jutting forward, but it's not to bite you. I really like Charles V very much.
Yeah, no, so do I. He's I think, one of the great heroes of history. And he has the wisdom then to divide the empire. He realises that it was too much for one man.
Yes.
And so your branch family comes from Ferdinand, the next... it is Ferdinand.
Ferdinand, his brother, yes.
And Spain goes off to Philip II.
Yes, exactly. So what you have then for about 150 years is 2 branches of the Habsburgs. The Austrian branch looking after Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, neighboring countries, and the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish branch looking after the rest of the world. And of course you have the famous time where the 2 branches intermarried, which led to some genetical problems, and it didn't lead to the Habsburg jaw.
Because
which is interesting enough, because it predates.
Yes.
Most people will repeat, even big English newspapers like to repeat this story. No, it was there before. It was there when Maximilian is old, you can already tell it. So nothing to do with intermarrying.
And the other thing that's untrue is that the Spanish lisp doesn't come from the Habsburgs. It predates the Habsburgs being kings of Spain.
Yes, of course.
So you can't take the blame for all these things.
And Marie Antoinette never said, let them eat cake.
Yeah. Now, Marie Antoinette, daughter of Mary Theresa. Mary Theresa, a very interesting figure, managing as a woman to rule a very male throne, similar in a way to Elizabeth I. Very pious, very, very Catholic.
Yes. Perhaps sometimes a bit overwhelmed. You have to imagine her situation. The Habsburg Spanish line had died. The Austrian line was about to die. Her father for 10 years had no children. Then he had 2 daughters. Then he convinced the other rulers of Europe to agree to the pragmatische Sanktion. And it all depended on her having lots of children. And the moment her father died, all the armies of the surrounding countries moved in on this girl who wasn't prepared. The armies didn't work, the finances were bad, her ministers were old, and she was having children left, right, and center. And she really showed what a character she was. She was incredible. She was very dynamic. She was a real power woman. She was deeply devout, as you said. She was cheerful. She danced. She played cards every evening. And then she managed to put the Habsburgs back onto European stage by weaving a web of marriages all over Europe.
And quite cleverly, she gets her husband made Holy Roman Emperor.
Yes, of course.
But she runs her husband.
Well,
I mean, he's not a hard-boiled egg, is he? He does what he's told by his wife, as all good husbands do.
I think that it was a very good marriage. They loved each other.
They certainly loved each other, but she's
it was
in charge.
very clear who was the man in the house. Yes, definitely.
And she remains in charge when her son becomes Holy Roman Emperor as well.
Well, that's complicated because she let him co-rule with her for a while, and it's a difficult and complicated moment in the Habsburg family because is the impression of enlightenment that breaks into the Habsburg rule and sort of changes the way Catholicism is seen in Austria quite strongly. Before that, the Habsburgs were very devout, openly baroquely devout. After that, it was enlightened Catholicism, and that led Joseph II to do a few things that I'm very cross with him for.
Well, the dissolution of the monasteries is one of the great tragedies of English history, and likewise it's one of the great tragedies of Austrian history.
Only it came before in England.
Yeah, indeed.
And yes, at least they weren't destroyed. It's like every English painting has a beautiful destroyed monastery ruin in the background. We don't have that in Austria. But there were 2,000 and a few monasteries all over the monarchy. After Joseph II had ruled for 10 years, there were 1,000 less. He closed 1,000 monasteries. He closed every single contemplative monastery in Austria.
And then you get to the 19th century,
Yes.
and obviously the Napoleonic Wars. You have a marriage of an Austrian princess to Napoleon.
Yes.
You also have the great figure of Metternich, not himself, of course, a Habsburg, but key to European and Austrian politics in that period. What is the Habsburg view of Metternich?
Well, I learned to respect him very much, reading several biographies. In Austria, he wasn't loved, but he brought about the fall of Napoleon with his. He managed under the eyes of Napoleon, while being an ally, to organize the entire alliance against him. And Napoleon didn't get it to the last second. He was incredibly level, and his relationship with Castlereagh in England and all of this is one of the most fascinating things.
I think Metternich is a fascinating and important, much underrated figure.
Absolutely. The ultimate diplomat too, so yeah.
But 1848, bad year,
Yes.
almost as bad as 1789. Monarchies are weakened. Habsburgs remain, but the power base has changed.
Well, the problem was that up to 1848, the Habsburgs really lived what they usually stand for, which is subsidiarity. They respected every single country in the monarchy. And then 1848 came, and the Hungarians were troublesome from the point of view of Vienna. For my family, it's very special because I'm from the Hungarian branch of the Habsburgs. Mm-hmm. So one of my, not ancestors, but great-great-granduncles was with the Hungarians, bringing the demands to Vienna to my other great-great-grandfather. So we were on both sides of that conflict. And the point was the Hungarians were indeed right with their demands, but their demands would have broken the empire apart. So what happened was young Franz Joseph took over. This is the part that the Hungarians never forgave the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs asked the Russians for help, and with the help of the Russians, they crushed the Hungarian uprising against the Habsburg rule. And then for about 10 years, Franz Joseph makes a regime and takes back all of the rights of the Hungarians. And then in 1867, through the charming help of his wife, Empress Elizabeth, you get the Ausgleich between Austria and Hungary. And then I think the Austro-Hungarian Empire was, in my opinion, it was what the EU still hasn't managed to be. It was really a place where every single language, every single country was respected, had their say. Every religion was respected. And yes, and I very often say that Brussels could take a few pages out of our book.
Out of your book. And then the First World War, and Franz Joseph, very elderly emperor at that point, dies, 1916?
1916.
And it doesn't quite end there, but it almost does.
It almost does. In fact, if you ask my Habsburg family members who their favorite Habsburg is, of all these great characters we just spoke about, they would point to that friendly, mild-spoken, mustache-wearing young man that ruled for 1.5 years, lost the war, lost the empire, and died miserably in exile in Madeira 1.5 years later, or a year later. And why? Why is this harmless man? Many people don't even realize he exists. For us Habsburgs and for many, such a great example, because he is a giant of faith. He's a giant of faith. And his faith influenced his social politics, and his faith influenced everything, especially that from the first moment that he was on the throne, he tried to bring about peace in this terrible First World War, being called by the Pope, but he tried to jump onto every possible peace initiative because he had seen battle in the trenches. He's been on every front of the war, so he's a great example to all of us.
And is the blessed and on the road to sainthood.
Yes, absolutely.
In your book, you talk about being Catholic, and we've discussed that, the importance of family. You and I both have 6 children. But one of the things you talk about that the modern world, I think, finds most difficult is this concept of a good death. Tell me what happens when a Habsburg goes to meet his maker in bodily form and gets to the doors of the cathedral.
Ah, that's beautiful. We have the knocking ritual. It's absolutely beautiful. And I've seen it twice, although I never lived in an empire, but they resurrected this thing when Empress Zita, the last Austrian empress, was buried. I was present. And when Otto, her son, was buried, they twice did this again. It's very touching. The coffin arrives at the door of the Kapuzinergruft, which is the burial place of the Habsburgs. And the master of ceremony knocks at the door. And he says, and the voice from inside, the Capuchin monk, says, "Who is there?" And the master of ceremonies will say all the titles. Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Croatia, and all that, like 30 seconds of titles. And he will say, "We don't know him." And then he will knock again, said, "Who is there?" And then the master of ceremony will list all the achievements of the ruler. And again, the voice says, "We don't know him." And the third time he knocks and he says, "Who is there?" Franz Joseph, a poor sinner. And then the door opens and he can enter. Why did the Habsburgs do that? Because the Habsburgs were profoundly aware that they were an example to their subjects. With their death, with their way of being buried, they wanted to teach a good Catholic what it means to die. And a Habsburg ruler was as much a poor sinner, even if he was splendously dressed, than anybody in his reign. And people took notice. People took notice. This is the way you die. Nowadays, we don't think much about death, but the Habsburgs did all their lives.
And it underpinned their faith. We haven't unfortunately got time to go into the Emperor Maximilian's instructions on his death, which again are so symbolic.
Yes.
It is a wonderful book. I greatly enjoyed reading it. Your family is one of the most interesting in the world. Perhaps only the Windsors provide you with any serious competition.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for coming on and talking, and for the work you do as Ambassador to the Holy See.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.